Thank you so much to Raghu, to Lekha, and to Venu for agreeing to do this wonderful session. The book is titled Gandhian Architecture, A Time for Low-Cost Housing, and it's published by Routledge, India. And I'm very thrilled that this book has come out after 10 years of super hard work on the part of our author. I'm a little ebullient about this book, very enthusiastic. And I want to say, frame that enthusiasm about this book in the context of a larger body of work that's emerging about this time period from, let's say, the mid-20th century to now, which doesn't see the mid-20th century as a past that's over, but as a past that has a chance, it is continuous into the present and maybe shaping the future even as we speak. And Raghu will talk more, Venu will talk more about this when he does his presentation. This body of work is looking at, for example, the emergence, my own work, for example, looks at the emergence of Delhi blue pottery. Ajanta Subramaniam, who will hopefully have a chance to talk about and who spoke on BIC's streams about IITs and the education system and that was set up through the IITs and the question of caste. And other people, people like Lily Irani, who are working on questions of innovation in her wonderful book, Chasing Innovation. People like Arindam Datta in the US, and there are many other people. This is an important time to assess because this is a 1950s onwards when India had a chance to set policies of its own. It had a chance to make decisions as an independent nation state, which directions it would choose to follow, and how the past, the immediate past and the past, the really ancient past and the middle past, how soft and hard would that relationship to the past be? How weak or strong would it be to creating a new future for a new country? These are all questions that are very present in Venu's book. And I just want to summarize the chapters of the book very briefly, just to alert us to the contents, because this is a talk about a book. And I think that's important, though his own talk will be more specific theme from this book. So he begins with the introduction, and the introduction is titled The Enduring Present, which speaks to what I just said already. And then the first chapter is titled An Architecture of Finitude, talking about limits and means and the infinite in the way that Gandhi saw and Madeline Slade saw architecture at Seogaon and Wardha. The second chapter is looking at a very important low-cost housing exhibition that happened in 1954 and how Bapu Kuti, the place that was so closely associated with Gandhi in his own lifetime, is used to formulate the idea of develop varying ideas of low-cost housing at this exhibition. The third chapter is Urbanizing Finitude, For What Reason Must a Vernacular Architecture Die, which is a wonderful chapter, really a beautiful chapter. And it's a very, very precise and gentle meditation. It flows back and forth between a critique of Gandhi in Korea to an acceptance of that there are possibilities, even where they fail, there are possibilities for the future, which I think is a beautiful way of writing. So that is called Urbanizing Finitude, For What Reason Must a Vernacular Architecture Die? Charles Korea, Gandhi in India, circa 1974 through 2006. The fourth chapter goes back to Wardha, which I think is a beautiful movement backwards, the house that necessity built. So there are key words in Raghu's book, finitude, necessity, infinity, other keywords that are there. And these are these keywords that flow through each of these chapters. And they kind of guide the flow of the conversation and the historical work that he's doing, the philosophical and historical work that he's doing. And the fourth chapter really looks at ecology, economy, customization, and architecture in the global South. So maybe customization is a response to necessity. And that's a beautiful thought, instead of a limitation, seeing necessity as a limitation, maybe as an opportunity for a voice of people who are very close to Gandhi and Gandhian India, Gandhian geography, arriving at a new set of horizons, right? And the fifth chapter is regionalizing limits, the Vardha House language, identity, environment in Vagdara, which is a Kolami community village in near Vardha. And it's about how Gandhian architectural thinking is accepted, but not really valorized, not really given that much credence beyond a point in this village, which has bigger concerns, given the pressing concerns about, given the pressing issues around land use and appropriation of tribal lands for mega projects and all those kinds of things, right? So a larger sense of region and custodianship that develops. The last chapter, which is actually the afterword, focuses on Rajghat in Delhi and looking at how Gandhian thinking might become part of a larger gaze, a way of instantiating a public gaze, looking at the way that Gandhi was cremated in a space that was actually a very Mughal space, right? Rajghat was known as Rajghat even before it became Gandhi's Rajghat. So it's a beautiful book, and I'm so grateful to Venu for writing it, and also for bringing us to a place where we can converse with this. What a luxury and what a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to put myself on mute, and then you can start with your presentation. The way we'll do this is he will make the presentation, and then I'll ask a few key questions, and then we'll throw open the airwaves for more questions. I love radio, so I love using the word airwaves. So I'm very happy to do that. So please start.
Thank you, Annapurna. I think I'll just say I'm really grateful to the center and to Annapurna for sort of hearing me out, but also more importantly, reading the book. I think it takes a lot to actually sit through a whole book these days, and I think Annapurna has really patiently been through every chapter, and I think she's actually the first person to have actually read the whole book. So I think it just feels like, for an author, really, it feels like an honor to know that, that the book has been read. So I think that's a big thanks from my side. Also, before I start, I just wanted to mention, and I think what I'm going to say, I hope to make clear by the end of this presentation, which is that this question of the present that Annapurna was talking about, and the continuity of the present. Well, partly the way in which the present is framed in the book is this idea of a continuous present, which actually begins in 1936 and endures to the present, right? So it's a continuous present. It's also a certain take on the idea of historicity and history. And history, insofar as we approach it from the contours of this book, is actually seen as something that's fundamentally tied in with desire. The desire to actually step outside of one's present and to have this kind of distance from it, right? And to be able to see it and narrativize it without being completely consumed by it, being absorbed by it. And so that idea of a desire for history is something that's constantly thwarted in this book, right? And every chapter in the book completely is it's unable to rise to the level of history, because it lets go of the possibility of history. And I think that's not just my stating this, but it's actually the manner in which the content itself takes us in that direction. That historicity is not it's an ideal for the book, but it's not something that's realizable within the material world that this book actually engages. And I think that's at the core of this narrative. But then behind that question is the question of desire. And I think that's something which I hope to be able to try and get across in the brief presentation that I've actually tried to put together. So I'll start, and I'm not going to read out this presentation. I'm quickly going to sort of speak with each slide. So as I was trying to put this together, I sort of wanted to go back in time and to just begin to quickly describe my engagement with this theme. And in around 2004, I was actually, I was in Trivandrum, and I was staying in the CDS guest house in Ullur, and I was trying to actually get this interview with Laurie Baker, who was alive at that time, and I was very much interested in Baker for a variety of reasons, um, and not the least of which is the emphasis on materiality. And I think some of the things I'm going to say might sound very obvious, but I think I want to build this narrative bit by bit, sort of drawing on what seem to be the most obvious portions into perhaps something which is more substantive as we move along. So part of the idea, of course, was also to stay loyal to a very basic elementary training in architecture school, which is not very special. I mean, I think this is the kind of training that most of us are exposed to in architectural school, which is a strong emphasis on materiality, and to also ground ideality or idealism fundamentally in an emphasis on on the truth of materials. At least this is the kind of exposure that one was wont to have, let's say, in the mid 90s, which is when I'd actually entered architecture school, which is the School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi. So a very strong emphasis on building construction. I presume it's not very different in the present. Um, and also what's interesting at that time is also that at the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi, there was also an interest in the history of how we arrive at this emphasis on materiality in architecture, right? So that our library was kind of stocked with all these books by these luminaries, including Laurie Baker, references to John Ruskin, for instance, going back to the 19th century, right? And the idea of the truth of materials and the idea of truth and materiality strongly tied in with this idea of ideality, right? So this is something which I think traveled with me as I'm sort of going to Trivandrum in 2004, trying to seek an interview with Laurie Baker, and that's where I was, right? And what's interesting though is I never did get to meet Baker. I stayed in this building which he'd actually created. I was in conversation with his son, but I couldn't meet him because he was very old at that time and he was not keeping very well. But I did get to speak to him by phone at length, but I never did get to meet the person. So here I am, sort of surrounded by this world of which is evidence of Baker's material imagination, right? Baker's sort of selection of materials, etc. But I'm kind of bereft of Baker in a corporeal sense. I'm not really meeting him in person. I don't know the body of Baker. I know the materiality that he's actually working with. So this was my early sort of introduction. I'd already been about 4 years after graduating from architecture school when I was actually going back into trying to get to know more about construction in Baker by traveling to Trivandrum. So the interesting thing is, so if you actually, in 2004, I'm trying to reconstruct and trying to understand how must I begin to have access to Baker. I can't meet the person; he's not well. I'm able to actually see the buildings that he's built, and I'm also reading, a lot of these texts which actually are circulating both in Trivandrum and in Delhi. I mean, the School of Planning and Architecture already had a lot of literature and dissertations on Baker. And so, this is the kind of stuff that I'm doing in the absence of actually the opportunity of meeting with the person himself. I did go to Hamlet Nalanchira, where his office was, but simply couldn't meet him. So in terms of like the materiality of what he has to say and the textual sources, right? Baker's sort of basic sort of instructions to architects, as most architects perhaps in India would be aware, there's so many different ways in which they reach you, right? I mean, these kinds of commandments that he sort of puts together, right? Only accept reasonable briefs, discourage extravagance and snobbery. I mean, these are the kinds of things that you would actually get from textual sources. So it's not terribly difficult to run into this kind of material for a student of architecture in India. And so it's really stating the obvious. But then there's also the biography of Baker, which I happened to read at that time. Gautam Bhatia, again, another very well-known architect, writing about Baker, and all these interviews that this text is sort of interspersed with, right? And in this, again, this one section where, Baker sort of begins to reminisce about his meeting with Gandhi, right? And so this is one of the things that you actually see in Gautam Bhatia's book, which is one of the things that which is Gandhi, said and has influenced my thinking, that the ideal house in the ideal village will be built using material that is found within a 5-mile radius of the house, right? So already you're seeing an emphasis on limits, right? So there's some such thing as a limit of a 5-mile radius. But the more important thing here is, and again, just to reiterate a very simple point that I mentioned earlier, which is that the idea of ideality or the idealism in architecture is fundamentally sort of predicated on materiality, right? So even if Laurie Baker is talking about an ideal house or an ideal village, he's grounding that idealism on materiality. That is the materiality of some material which is found within a 5-mile radius around the house, right? So what you are seeing at a very simple level, without going too far into this, is this idea of a Gandhian idealism, which is predicated on materiality. So this is a sort of very simple message that one can take from Baker, that there is no such thing as Gandhiism bereft of an emphasis on materiality, right? So which in turn is where I went, right? I mean, I sort of became very curious about, about this person who actually met Baker, this Gandhi, in the early 1940s, and where did he come from when he sort of emphasized an idealism that was predicated on the prior sort of existence of a materialism, right? Of a sense of materiality, of a particular kind of materiality. So these were the simple enough questions that I'd sort of, was trying to sort of unpack as a graduate student at that time. And so that's where I was going. And then I thought one way of moving forward in this matter would be to actually try and understand this meeting between Baker and Gandhi, which happened probably, I think the exact date is not given, but it certainly would have happened before August 1942, because that's the time when Gandhi is put in prison in the Aga Khan Palace for the Quit India movement that he sort of launches, right? So I sort of started looking at the portions of the archive, the Gandhi archive, that is, where I'm trying to begin to understand Gandhi's discourse at that time. What it is that actually makes Gandhi say that there should be a limit of a 5-mile radius, right, for actually imagining the materiality of an ideal house in an ideal village. So this is what I sort of start doing. And it's around this time, which is around 2006-07, there's this text called Key to Health, which sort of comes tumbling out of the archive, right? Which is, it's a collection of essays by Gandhi, which he writes actually after presumably meeting Baker, when he's actually in the Aga Khan Palace and in prison. And he's not particularly well. He's actually suffered a lot of severe losses. His that is Kasturba, has passed away, and Mahadev Desai has passed away. And he's also not particularly well himself. So around this time that he writes this text, Key to Health, right? And it's interesting for a variety of reasons, and as you'll see for us from the perspective of architecture, in a negative sense. But to begin with, it's principally a text that is devoted to a relationship between corporeality and materiality, right? Which is a relationship between the body, right? Remember, I just mentioned that I didn't, there was a difference between Laurie Baker as somebody who's thinking about materiality and Laurie Baker as a body, as a corporeal being whom I didn't meet. So it's the same question here, although it's a very different way in which it gets structured, which is that Key to Health is about bodily health, right? And Gandhi is actually writing about what are the practices that actually are entailed in actually keeping oneself well. But he's also sort of trying to emphasize this from the foundation of these 5 elements, which are material elements that actually have some say in the manner in which, or the extent to which, we are able to preserve bodily health, right? So in that sense, it's a text that is kind of stitching together a strange relationship between the body and the material world. And of course, this is written in the material confines of the Aga Khan Palace. And this is a photograph from 1944. And just to give you a quick sense of what this is, here's a Hindi translation of this text, which is the Arogya Ki Kunji. And so what struck me as an important part of this text, which I think seemed to matter a bit when it came to sort of thinking about architecture at that time, was a particular component called Akash, right? So this text, Key to Health, is a chapter called Akash. And this is the Hindi version of it. And it's a sort of a paradoxical text. It kind of loosely translates into ether, but Akash can mean a whole range of things. But what it does, this text, is that it actually pits the body against its own materiality. And I think that's the very strange kind of way in which this text unfolds. It's very poetic, but it's kind of full of what you would tentatively call Gandhian negations. And I think we can talk about that at length. But I think just to give you a sense of one negation, which is fundamental, which is this sort of this strange conflict between the body and its own embodiment. I think that's something which will become hopefully clearer as I try and explain this, which is that when Gandhi is actually thinking of the body, he's not thinking of the body in a positive sense as he's writing Akash, which is the peculiar aspect of Akash, which is that the body, he approaches it as a negative thing, which is the body, if you understand something like negative theology, the body is that which remains after architecture, clothes, and material needs have been negated or marginalized, right? So which is to say that the body doesn't have any positive content of its own. Rather, the body is that which remains after you've removed all of these things, right, from sight or from the vicinity. So it's a sort of a negative component conception of the body. And it's also a text in which the body is a protagonist. And I think one thing about Gandhian literature, and even photography in the sense, and you're actually thinking about Gandhi, is that the body, the corporeal self, is a substantive protagonist in Gandhian narratives. But as we'll see, it also is a body which is not having a body of its own, if we are to sort of stick with the idea of Akash. It is a protagonist that principally exists as a negation of bodily desires and bodily needs. So it's a body that actually lets go of its own desire for material comforts and vestments and architecture, as you'll see. So this is the kind of a very paradoxical conception of the body that sort of started becoming apparent as, trying to look at the time at which he meets Baker, and then you actually start looking into the archive and you find it's not a very straightforward narrative about buildings. Rather, it's something entirely different. It's actually the negation of buildings that Gandhi seems to be writing about. And so sort of give you a sense that, there's a clear distinction between corporeality, which is the body, and materiality, right? One would imagine these two things are exactly the same, but in Gandhi's writing, you start seeing some kind of a strange dissonance between these two categories, right? So you sort of basically see that the protagonicity of the body, that the body emerges as a protagonist only through a conspicuous negation of its material vestments, right, which is architecture and clothes. So you really are left with a body which is nothing in itself, but rather it's only the negative of architecture and clothes, right? And that's a very strange kind of paradoxical formulation that seems to emerge from as you sort of read Akash, right? And so now, just to sort of mention that the centrality or the protagonicity of Gandhi's body to Gandhian politics is actually, it's quite well documented. There is this sort of whole body of writing about it. Joseph Alter, for instance, has written a very substantive text called Gandhi's Body, Sex, Diet, and the Politics of Nationalism. And you do find that, as Alter sort of suggests, that you can't imagine Gandhi's politics without thinking about Gandhi's emphasis on his own body, right? So whatever experiments he wants to do at a larger political scale, he first does them on himself by the means of experimenting with his body, right? So it's a sort of a very embodied and a corporeal kind of politics that Gandhi kind of espouses, right? And I think if you're sort of looking for evidence of this, it's not terribly hard to come by. I mean, there's enough in the world of photography to actually tell you how much of an emphasis Gandhi sort of places on this body, the kind of obsession that he has with his own body, right? So I think this is not something that requires much explanation, but it's still important to sort of state, or perhaps understate, insofar as it's already so overstated in the photography. So what we're looking at is that there is this very strong sense of how Gandhi sort of emphasizes politics by demonstrating the protagonicity of his own body, right? So this question of the protagonicity, the protagonist, the body as a protagonist in Gandhian political narratives is something that I think it sort of increasingly comes through to us, right? And that's something that's, as I was saying, there's enough imagery to suggest that this happens. And it's not just the protagonicity of the body when you're actually thinking of Gandhi's politics, you're also thinking of the protagonicity of community, right? What's interesting is that Gandhi's body sort of, the boundaries of where his body begins and where community begins, right? I mean, where his body ends and where community begins, that also begins to get blurred, right? So essentially what you're seeing is that it is an embodied corporeal politics, and this body can also be seen as some kind of a body politic that contains these multitudes, these people that he's representing, right? So these are the kinds of questions that you're seeing, that there is this kind of protagonicity or the centrality of Gandhi's body and these communities that he's representing. And at the same time, the paradox is that if you're actually approaching this idea of the body from this text titled Key to Health in 1942 onwards to 1944, this body is nothing at all, which is to say that this body is not a positive entity unto itself. Rather, it is a negation of architectural flows, right? So this kind of very strange reversal of this very entity that is so central to imagining Gandhi is in itself not having any positive conception of its own, especially in his writing, as you sort of observe it in this text called Key to Health, or specifically in the section called Akash. So this was the kind of paradox that I was sort of beginning to engage with. And for me, of course, the question was, my kind of ears perked up and my eyes were sort of really attentive when I see the word building, right, in the text, which is that it's a negation of buildings, no roofs and houses between us and the sky. The body should be completely left outside. The moment he mentions that in Akash, that's when I kind of am beginning to see, well, he's really not interested in built spaces. Or at least in this text, he seems to be suggesting that we've got to leave behind built volumes and built spaces in the favor of being out in the open, where the body actually is completely pure, right? Now, this is where, it sort of begins to occur to me that, well, if he's really only interested in the protagonicity of the body, or that's the principal protagonist in his political narratives, then what about architecture, right? I mean, at what point in time, like, where does architecture stand in Gandhi's imagination, right? I mean, here's a person who's telling Laurie Baker that, that the ideal house and the ideal village will be built with material using material that is found within a 5-mile radius of the house, on the one hand. And at the same time, he's also sort of denying this architecture, its sort of protagonicity, by he's simply saying that architecture has to be sidelined, it has to be discarded, it has to be left behind because the body is most important, right? So, I mean, however simplistic this might sound, I think it does present us with the question that, is there anything to say at all about Gandhi and architecture? I mean, apart from the fact that Baker's actually had this, injunction given to him. So this sort of became a concern for a number of reasons and for a long period of time. And the question is, where is architecture in the Gandhian imagination? And at what point in time does architecture become the protagonist, if indeed it ever does become one, right, in Gandhi's imagination? I think some answers to this question, of course, I mean, if you actually, so I started with like 1942, 44, and I started working my way backwards in the archive. I've also looked at the 1920s, but I think for me, I think the 1930s presents a particularly complex sort of patch of time. And perhaps as we'll see, you'll begin to recognize why that is the case. But in the mid-1930s, it is indeed the case that Gandhi actually is interested in architecture, and that there is some such thing as the protagonicity of architecture in the Gandhian narrative, right? Which to a lesser or perhaps greater extent is able to overshadow the protagonicity of the body in the Gandhian narrative. And that's when, in 1936, Gandhi actually shifts to Shegaon, or what is known, or what came to be known starting from around 1939-40 onwards as Sevagram. And so Gandhi actually shifts to this village to take up constructive village improvement work in 1936. This is sometime after he's actually already left the Congress, and he's been staying in Wardha, but he's also been traveling around. And so he shifts from this house that he's staying, this house owned by Jamnalal Bajaj in the city of Wardha, town of Wardha, and then moves to this village called Shegaon, where his follower, Madeline Slade, also more popularly known as Miraben, designs and builds him this hut, which is today known as Adi Nivas. And so the construction of this structure does have references to it, in the archive. So the archive has a sort of a set of portions devoted to construction, and also to Gandhi's experiences. And I think we'll talk about that in a second. And this is, of course, the second hut, which Slade actually builds slightly later, by around the end of 1936, beginning 1937, where this is a hut she was having for herself for carding and spinning. And then she actually transforms this into, as she mentions in her autobiography, The Spirit's Pilgrimage, a proper cottage for Bapu. And this today, of course, is known as Bapu Kuti. And I think we'll talk about this at length as we move along. So this is an image of Slade. And we'll also talk about Slade very briefly. And so just to give you a sense, so as I'm saying, if there ever was an instance of the protagonicity of architecture in the Gandhian imagination, it is here at Shegaon, right? I mean, insofar as we stay loyal to the archive, right? But it's also the case that when I actually started, and the same year I tried to actually meet Laurie Baker, I traveled to Wardha and I stayed in Shegaon. That time I was actually staying with the family of the late Venugopal, and I traveled from Nagpur to Wardha. And then I sort of went and interviewed a Gandhian, the late Professor Thakurdas Bang. And, I was trying to ask him about Bapu Kuti, and I was kind of, asking him, about in what ways would one actually begin to, understand the architecture of that structure. And here's what he said. He just said that, why are you studying Bapu Kuti? Why are you studying these huts? You should study what is outside. You should study the whole. You can't just study this hut. And he himself, by the way, was staying in a hut. And I think that kind of stayed with me, right? And the point is that here again, you have the denial of the protagonicity, if you will, of architecture, right? I mean, that, it's really the protagonicity of the whole, which is more important in this narrative. That if you were to actually just get caught with a bit piece over here, which is architecture, then you'd miss the point, right? And that's roughly what Professor Bang Sahib, as he was known at that time, Bang Sahib ne ye kaha ki, you can't possibly be just, missing the larger story over here. So again, you sort of feel thwarted that, like, look, is there anything to this idea of the centrality of architecture in the Gandhian imagination? Well, apparently not. So, and this is, of course, also tied in with the idea of Akash, right? If you remember that text which I was saying, that Gandhi himself is denying architecture any possibility of protagonicity. It can only exist as a weak, decentered artifact, as a negated artifact in his imagination, at least by 1942. Although it is the case that he's also written about this in 1931, when he's actually in the Yeravada jail. But more on that later. So here you have, on the one hand, the protagonicity of the Gandhian body, of Gandhi's body. You have the protagonicity of the whole, but you don't have any protagonicity for architecture, right? It is not central to the Gandhian imagination, or so it seems. But even so, if one were to persevere, and I did persevere with architecture as protagonist, how would that happen, right? I mean, if you're looking at the archive, to what extent does the archive bear it out, right? And I think there are two narrative frameworks which sort of emerge. One is to think of Gandhi's or the Gandhians' everyday life and action as being influenced by a powerful physical or social environment, which is a latent world of architecture. So which means that you actually study the architecture of Shegaon as a powerful latent force that actually affected the lives of those who inhabited it, right? That's one way in which the archive would suggest, or at least some evidence would suggest that Shegaon actually can be central to a Gandhian narrative, the architecture of Shegaon. The second way is, of course, on a wholly different tangent, is to actually imagine Gandhi as a kind of a sovereign being, or as an architect, if you will, involved in the making of a physical world or a latent world of architecture. First, so there's a kind of a distinction. There's two different kinds of narratives. One is Gandhi or Gandhiism as being made by architecture, which is that architecture becomes a powerful external force that actually has an impact on people and actually makes people and makes their thoughts. But the second way in which you can actually imagine it is Gandhi as Gandhi making architecture, right? And that's a different kind of a conception of the protagonicity of the architect, so to say. And I think there's something to be said about both possibilities, at least insofar as one looks at the archival record, right? Adi Nivas, for instance, if you actually imagine Adi Nivas as a setting, as a powerful setting, which has its own sort of impact on its inhabitants, there is a story to be told. I mean, as for instance is the case with this particular text, which actually is a conversation which actually happens in Shegaon, which is Sevagram, in early March 1948, roughly 6 weeks after Gandhi had been assassinated, right? And Gandhi had himself planned for this meeting in February 1948, not knowing, of course, that he'd be dead by January. And this is a meeting between Nehru, Rajendra Prasad, Vinoba Bhave, J.B. Kripalani, Jayaprakash Narayan, and others, right? And so essentially, what you're seeing is that the Sevagram ashram, which comprises Adi Niwas, becomes the setting for a massive sort of moment, exercise in self-reflection, right? And so what's happening is that there's an attempt at actually reflecting on a sort of a political strategy in a post-Gandhian, post-colonial India, right? So to that extent, the ashram and the architecture of the ashram becomes a participant in this narrative, because the ashram stands for the fixity and the fidelity. The ashram stands for the sort of the legacy of Gandhian ideas, right? And so to that extent, it actually a fidelity towards Gandhian ideals is to also sort of exercise a fidelity towards this Gandhian architecture, which is the setting for this political conversation. So to that extent, architecture becomes a kind of a space that actually brings the past into the present, right? In that conversation, in the post-Gandhian environment. That Gandhi isn't gone insofar as this material legacy remains, and that is continually pushing us to constantly keep the ideals that he stood for in the forefront. And so this is somewhat different from, as I was saying, so this was the idea. The fidelity to Gandhian ideas in a post-Gandhian India is via the fidelity to the architecture of Segaon. So in that sense, architecture becomes a kind of a mute, but nevertheless powerful protagonist in this new narrative that is emerging in a post-Gandhian India. So it is a latent world. It is a world that serves as a backdrop, but nevertheless intrudes into the foreground. It nevertheless casts its shadows into the foreground. It nevertheless serves to actually, to some level, affect the people who are inhabiting it and the nature of the conversations they're having within it. This is one way in which we can imagine the protagonicity of a Gandhian architecture, right? But this is somewhat different from the second kind of narrative where the architect emerges as a protagonist, the protagonicity of making, right? And that's where you sort of enter into the archive, and especially in the mid-1930s, the portions of the archive where Gandhi's acutely involved in the making of these structures, along with Madeline Slade, right? So both of them, to that extent, actually represent Gandhi and Madeline Slade together. And this is the plan of the structure of Bapupati. And this is an interior view, as sort of creative individuals, perhaps, with some kind of a sovereign sense of control over the process of making, right? So what you begin to then see is the protagonicity of Gandhi and Madeline Slade co-constituting this architectural consciousness, if you will, right? So this is another way in which you can begin to imagine, maybe not so much the protagonicity of architecture, but certainly the protagonicity of an architectural consciousness that emerges in the Gandhian imagination, right? And this you will find some evidence in the archival record, right? And so the question becomes, who is the maker of these structures, and to what extent is creative control exercised in their creation, right? So that's one way in which we can imagine that there is space for centering the practice of architecture or the creation of built space in the Gandhian archival record. So the architecture as a protagonist. So this is sort of where I started going, right? I mean, after having been through this sort of detour. And then, of course, this raises the very simple and straightforward questions, the question of responsibility. Whose desires does architecture represent? And the question of a sense of sovereignty that the architect actually exercises over the process of making, and the question of who is sovereign, right? An architect as a sovereign, as somebody who controls processes. So now this is where this massive paradox starts to emerge. If you were to actually pursue this line of thinking, right? And this is where actually the book project that I think we're talking about and Annapurna is talking about actually begins. Which is that if you're beginning to talk about Shegaon, or same or
Venu,
ground. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
shall we do another 5 to 8 minutes and then give time for questions, please?
Sure, sure, sure,
Thank
sure.
you so much.
Yeah. So, which is where you start seeing that the discourse surrounding the creation of these structures is not about an architect sort of translating what they imagine or what they desire into a material form, as much as it is around the idea of letting go of desire and letting go of the idea that one has. So the discourse surrounding the creation of what eventually came to be known as Adi Nivas and Babu Kuti was about letting go of an architecture Gandhi desired in the favor of an architecture that was finite or limited within a predetermined construction expenditure. So, which means that the creation of Babu Kuti and Adi Nivas relate more to the idea of foregoing a sense of the sovereignty of an architect's desire for the creation of a habitation for himself or herself. So how does one then approach architecture not so much as the act of making or shaping the world to conform to an inward impression that one has, but rather as a result of an effort at foregoing or sacrificing an inward impression, right? And so this is an important question. Actually, you're looking not so much at the protagonicity of the architect or an architectural consciousness creating these buildings, rather you're looking at the sacrifice of an architectural consciousness, the letting go of desire, the letting go of the desire for a house of one's own in one's own thoughts, right? And this is where the idea of low cost comes up principally as a letting go of desire. It doesn't have to be that way, but in the portion of the archive that you're looking at, the way it emerges is that it's about sacrifice. So what you're looking at is the protagonicity, not so much of an architectural consciousness, but the protagonicity of sacrifice and the sacrifice of self, of sovereignty and desire, right? So this, in that sense, then is, what is the protagonist in this narrative? That it's not so much the architect who's actually thinking about building these buildings. It is the foregoing of a sense of desire, of an ideal architecture, in order to actually make do with a low-cost housing architecture, which is with a sense of sacrifice that you begin to actually understand these spaces, right? So this essentially becomes the new protagonist, sacrifice as a protagonist. And that's where the book begins, where it is talking about this idea of sacrifice and staying within the limits, staying within the finite world, sacrificing the desire to become infinite, to stay within only what is limited, to stay within the limits that have been set, right? That becomes the sort of basis for the architectural imagination for the book, right? And so the architecture that is the result of the foregoing of an architecture ideally suited to the self, a less than ideal architecture, which always, of course, carries along with itself, the ghost of ideality, right? That for all of these residences, there is something else which was ideal, which had to be abnegated, so as to make do with that which could only be accomplished within the finite budget. This is something that you find in the archive, where Gandhi is constantly saying, I would like to let go of a hut for Mahadev Desai. I would like to let go of partitions in the house because I want to stay within this limited budget, right? So the fidelity to staying within the proper place of the budget, right? This is the world that we're actually looking at. And interestingly enough, this world of sacrifice is also, curiously, in 1935-36 in the Gandhi archive, contemporaneous with the world of Varnashrama Dharma, in which Kshatriyas forego their own desire and their own sense of sovereignty. And by, of course, foregoing desire and a sense of sovereignty over the self, they preserve the sovereignty of Varnashrama Dharma. So this is a kind of another paradoxical formation, because what you start seeing in the archive, roughly at the same time that Gandhi is actually foregoing his desire for a more perhaps suitable and desirable accommodation for himself, simply to stay within the budget that he identifies, is also the time when he's actually beginning to talk about these warrior beings who stay in the place that is proper to them and don't let go of it self-sacrificially, even when they face danger, right? So this is something that is increasingly sort of taking over his language. And it's also the time when this is taking over his language, when he's actually staying in this village, when he's faced malaria, when he's had a nervous breakdown, where he's had blood pressure issues, he's himself almost on the deathbed. And it's at this time that he's actually insisting that I need to stay in this village for 3 seasons to understand the conditions of the people who are living here, right? And so against his own desire to leave the place, he's insisting on staying in Shegaon. So what you see then is this kind of a comparable understanding of sacrifice that is emerging in Gandhian discourse in 1936 at all levels, right? It's at the level of construction, it's at the level of staying in Shegao, it's it's at the level of staying in. It's also in the context of asking village workers to stay rooted in the village, right? So he's constantly admonishing village workers to stay in their place, right, rather than leave it, even if it is at great expense to themselves. And this is a very paradoxical thing because um, um, partly this is also happening when he's in conversation with Dr. Ambedkar at this time. 1936 is when Dr. Ambedkar is actually going to publish, his speech for the Jatpat Todak Mandal, and Gandhi is constantly emphasizing this idea of staying within the faith that is accorded to oneself, right? So this kind of a very difficult conversation between the idea of staying in the place that is proper to oneself and the kind of material world that he inhabits, where it's again demonstrably accomplished at in every register, but even in the level of talking about building, right? This very sort of almost very strong emphasis on staying within the finite bounds of what is supposedly proper to oneself is what you're looking at. So I think once, if we sort of start taking this idea of sacrifice as a principal protagonist, and not so much an architectural consciousness or architect as a protagonist, then we have secondarily a very different kind of architectural narrative on low-cost housing that begins to emerge, right? And so the story of Gandhian low-cost housing as it begins in Segaon is not so much a story of the architect as a sovereign being who creates Adi Niwas and Bapu Putti. Rather, it is a story of a self-sacrificial foregoing of self and sovereignty, or of a self-sacrificial foregoing of building expenditure, if you will, in the favor of staying in the place of low-cost housing. And the word place is very important. So the protagonicity that you're seeing is the protagonicity of the negation of the self, of self-interest. And so this becomes a central theme of the book on Gandhian architecture, and this is where it begins. And what you see progressively through every chapter is how the way in which the emergence of the protagonicity of the negation of the self, the necessity undergirding the emergence of this negation constantly keeps shifting places, right? So over a period of 73 years that this book actually captures, starting from 1936 to around 2013, 14, when the work ends, every chapter is talking about a very different set of circumstances leading to the negation of the self, right? And the emergence of the protagonist, the negation of the self as a protagonist in the narrative. So in the first chapter, for instance, in the architecture of finitude, the necessity, Varnashrama Dharma is the necessity for the emergence of the protagonist, emergence of the protagonicity of the negation of the self, right? In the second chapter, it's democratic politics and also the sort of idea of housing for all, which becomes the necessity for the emergence of the protagonicity of the negation of the self, right? And especially with the emergence of the 5-year plan, there's this constant attempt on the part of the writers of the plan and also the organizers of this low-cost housing exhibition in 1954 to efface themselves, to create this idea of impersonality, right? So here it's not so much Varnashrama Dharma, apparently, that is pushing for this negation of the self, but rather a kind of a new impersonality, which is principally coming from a statistical conception of housing, which is actually constantly pushing for this idea of a neutrality and the selflessness of that being who does housing thinking. So nobody knows who is doing housing thinking because the possibility of a consciousness doing it is completely removed from the 5-year plan. It's simply demographic spurts that seem to be doing this thinking. And in the next chapter, which is on Korea again, and here Korea emerges, principally as this most fascinating architect who actually is able to really capture this idea of the emergence of this sort of this negation of the self as a protagonist. Because if you actually look at Korea's discourse in the 1970s, Korea is this thinker par excellence of how the city thinks of an architecture for itself, right? So the task of an architect is simply to become a mirror to the city, right? So the architect must have no self. Rather, the architect is best at work when he or she is sort of effortlessly reflecting what the city wants and what the city needs, and what climatology wants and what climatology needs. So if you actually look at his discourse, he's saying, I'm not doing anything. The city is doing everything through me. Climate is doing everything through me, right? So this kind of the emergence again of this kind of protagonicity of the negation of the self that you see in Charles Fourier, that becomes the next chapter in Urbanizing Finitude, right? And then, of course, another chapter where, again, ecological imperatives that start emerging in the 1970s, again, take away any emphasis from this kind of self or this architectural self that can actually bring about any kind of dramatic transformation. And finally, of course, more recently, looking at the final chapter, which is in the Kolam community, it's really not individual sort of denizens of this community in Baghdara that actually are somehow thinking of architecture as much as it's this idea of foregrounding a kind of a language-based identitarianism at a larger level, which actually leads to the the necessity of the emergence of the protagonicity of the negation of the self. Very complicated sentence, but I can't imagine a simpler way of saying it. But it's because it's in the reverse that I'm trying to actually state things. So really, I mean, throughout this, it's really this narrative is about the necessity of a kind of a negation of the architect's sovereign sense of the self. So it's actually, the protagonist is this kind of dying of the self, right, throughout this text. And I think that's what I just wanted to foreground and incrementally bring it up all the way from Laurie Baker. I just wanted to say, I think the most extraordinary representative of this consciousness, I think, in Indian architectural history is Charles Fourier, without doubt, because I think he's so articulate, first of all, but I think he really is able to weave his way through this idea of a loss of a sense of this kind of, this sense of sovereignty of the architectural consciousness, and really weave it and completely sort of embed it within the city's kind of narrative structure as a kind of a protagonist, right? And to really become this kind of effortless, voice for the city, right? I mean, that's something, and not just that, an effortless voice for climate also, right? Because this whole idea of climate responsiveness. So cities apparently build themselves. Climate apparently builds cities, right? So you'd find, this conception of the absence of the protagonicity of an architectural consciousness that's actually responsible for doing these things most strongly represented in Korea's writing. It's another thing that, of course, Korea is quite a fascinating architect with a very strong sovereign sense of control over the work that he did. But I think what you'll see in this book is a very different kind of Korea, as somebody who's really representing that kind of central lack, that kind of loss of protagonicity. And to that extent, I think he sees himself principally as a Gandhian, right? I mean, rightly so, insofar as that's where it begins, but for entirely different reasons. So I think I'll end at this. Then maybe I'll.
Wonderful, wonderful presentation. I'm also going to turn on my video.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for a very thoughtful presentation and really a very complex argument that you presented very neatly and simply. So I'm going to throw one question at you because we have a limited amount of time, and I want to really push you a little bit to explore this idea. And we've talked about it in preparation for today's conversation, which is that one of the things I really like about your book is the question of how the we is produced to create the impersonal, and how it links potentially to the impersonalism of Varnashrama Dharma. And I thought that was a very nice, the negation of the self produces a we.
Yeah.
And I would like you to explore that. But in added to that, I'd also like to ask you if you could explore with us this idea of competition that the low-cost exhibition made to create model housing that was low cost. There's a question in here in one of the Q&A also about low-cost housing, so I think that would cover that. And I think it would be really nice to tie to larger questions that were floating through the nation at the time and continue to float through, which is how do we, what are the technologies that we use to create this impersonality, and how does, and this sense of we, and what cast does that sense of we sometimes have? So I'd like to leave it there, and then I'm only going to ask you one question so other people can have.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I was also looking at this text that you'd shared by Ajanta Subramaniam, and I found it interesting because I think she's also talking about in the post-independence India, the emphasis on the emergence of this kind of impersonality, especially in education and higher education in the IITs, a strong sense of the absence of caste and a strong emphasis on merit. And merit, of course, always being a reference to uh, removal of the question of identity, at least in terms of caste. And so I think the issue is, and I think as we'll see in the book, impersonality or the absence of a sense of self or the negation of a sense of self, which is kind of what the book seems to constantly emphasize. Um, it can be mobilized for a variety of reasons, you know. So as for instance, Ajanta Subramaniam mentions in the context of the IITs, right, where she's saying that this very strong sense of merit, that like trying to move away from this question of a sense of the identities of those who are actually seeking higher education, and their competition being strictly governed by their capabilities in the arena of education itself, and not any kind of identity that they bring with them from a background, is in itself an identity assertion, is what she's trying to say, which is to say that the way emphasis on merit is a way of actually trying to assert a kind of a, if you will, an upper caste identity. And there again, I think even in the question of impersonality, right? For what reasons is impersonality deployed? For what reasons is a lack of identity, or let's just say a foregoing of a sense of the self deployed? That it can somehow insidiously, in a kind of invisible manner, come back to reassert a sense of identity. So I think to that extent, to answer your question, um, this idea of impersonality in itself, it can contain, it's like a Trojan horse. It can contain within it a certain kind of an identitarian discourse, a majoritarian discourse also, if possible, if you will. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I think it just points in that direction. I don't know if that, what do you think?
I think it's pointing in that direction. I'd like to give space to Saurav Karthikeyan, time to Saurav Karthikeyan's question.
Yeah.
And it's a more general question, but I think it's really wonderful to parry it between ourselves and all of us. In today's world, do you think it's possible to construct low-cost Gandhian type constructions in a modern world? So there's a load of historical terms here: modern, Gandhian, today's world. So there's a lot of presence that you'll have to grapple with. So that I would like you to address his question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think, but I think like I feel at some level, I mean, it's but expected that a book which is titled A Time for Low Cost Housing would probably be giving answers to a question related to how would we solve the housing problem in the present. I think that's something that I think the book sets up with its title. But I think my concern is not just to pointing towards a kind of solutionism, that there is a reason that we have to embrace Gandhian low-cost housing today in the present. Rather, I think it's important to understand that housing as a question and finitude as themes are far bigger. And I think if you actually look at it, the idea of the house itself is not also simply the matter of creating a kind of a husk or a physical shell. That a house is a set of relationships, that a house is a set of networks, that a house is a set of possibilities. A house is a constellation of services that are, for instance, coming together, right? So I think if you actually look at the book, you'd probably realize that there's one end of it which is talking about a certain kind of a materiality of housing. And at the other end, it's also struggling to sort of look at this idea that housing is not, it's about land, it's about a variety of other ingredients that actually together constitute this question of housing. So, strictly speaking, Gandhian low cost housing will not solve the problem of housing in the present. What it might do is, I think, studying it and studying its history might help us understand the complexity of the society that we live in, and understand how difficult it is to propose solutions, and to recognize actually the nature of the inequalities that actually exist in our society first, before plunging into solutionism. And I think that is very important in Indian society, because solutionism and simply providing people with houses is not going to solve the problem of housing. There are a number of fronts along which we'll have to think. And I think to that extent, the book is a small effort at trying to bring to light some of those concerns. I think that's as much as I'd like to say, but I can take on questions personally later by email if anybody is interested.
I'd like to ask you another question. If you could talk about the term, especially when you talk about the way that specific elements of architecture, in the roofing systems example, allow for this impersonality and this living within one's means sacrifice. What are the elements that allow for, what are the architectural elements that instantiate this idea of sacrifice in the various examples you've chosen? If you could take one and elaborate it. Another question has come, so I would appreciate it.
Well, I think there's a deeper question there, which is that I think at a very core level, there's a tension in this book. It's important to recognize that there is an emphasis on finitude, on sacrifice, if you will, on staying within the limits of the environmental resources that we have in our society, which are scarce, which are not as voluminous and unlimited as we imagine them to be. So that's at the heart of this book. But there's also the problem that finitude brings along with it, which is to actually, because the infinite is something that is what we desire. We desire for infinite growth, we desire for infinite expansion, for developmentalism. But our resource base will not bear us out. It will not allow us to actually live out that reality of the infinite, right? What we have is finite. So to that extent, finitude is something which is important. But on the obverse side of that, on the other side of that is the problem that finitude brings with it, which is that it is also the possibility of involution. It is also, the kind of violence of caste, the kinds of problems that we see in a sort of finite sense in society. So finitude has both of these aspects. Now, in the concrete sense of the architecture that we're talking about, I think to that extent, if you observe in the book, on the one hand, a finite architecture, or an architecture, for instance, that is, or even a village that is actually restricted spatially to the bounds of, let's say, a 10-mile radius, presents challenges in Segaon in 1936. But by around 2014-15, the idea of a local society, which extends to a 10-mile radius, becomes the grounds for actually resisting environmental degradation, right? So you can see these very contrasting approaches. So I don't think there's, you can actually take on finitude, as it is. It will always present the challenge of a certain kind of a hierarchical community that will emerge in a finite sense. But at the same time, we cannot let go of finitude either, because it also provides us with our only possibilities for actually living a life within the means that are actually available to us. I think I can only talk at the broadest levels, but I think the specificity of each chapter hopefully will answer some of these questions were the readers to actually explore.
And I'd like to thank you so much. That was a very good answer in the short time that you have. I want to end this with asking Pratiti Balal's question. If the effacement of the self is so central, who or what is the other? The self, the protagonist, the architect?
I think the question is, the most important thing is that, again, finitude has another extra dimension within it also, which is that staying within a finite space is not, one way of looking at it is you become comfortable within what you are. You become comfortable, you stay in your own place, and you keep promoting that sense of self and identity, and don't change. Don't allow yourself to be permeable or open to anything that comes from outside. But that's not the only way of looking at finitude, right? Even as Gandhi is actually staying in Segaon, the very fact that he stays rooted in that place also brings an element of danger. That to be rooted in one's own place is a space of vulnerability. Mm-hmm. So the self is also vulnerable in a space of the finite world of limits. To stay within limits can also be to make oneself vulnerable. And vulnerable to what? Vulnerable to the other, right? The other within oneself also exists. So the more time you probably spend with yourself, you also probably encounter the other within yourself, which you cannot tame, which also will only surface if you actually give that other the space to emerge. And to that extent, finitude contains this other parallel narrative as well. So I think perhaps some answers to these questions you might find in the book, but there is a lot of writing which actually engages with this idea of finitude, the idea of boundedness and vulnerability, which is also a part and a possibility. And that's the only possibility of hope in Gandhiism. That Gandhiism is ultimately not only about Varnashrama Dharma, that it also keeps the possibility of this vulnerability of the self, even within the space of finitude. And to that extent, we have to sort of keep all of these images in front of ourselves without actually, circumscribing or simply confining Gandhi to just one part of this narrative. I don't know, again, that sounds too broad, but I think given the nature of the material, these are the only ways I can imagine answering these questions.
Thank you for sharing, for bringing such a really lovely philosophical perspective to a very simple building, which is loaded with lots of things. And I know that for some people, these are very new approaches to thinking about low-cost housing, to Gandhi, and also to an architectural historian talking about that moment and its ongoing life. So I thank everyone for taking the time to be patient, to engage with ideas which are new and work that is very fresh. Thank you, Venu. Thank you, Raghu. Thank you, BIC Center, for having all of us. And thank you to all the guest participants who've taken the time to be here today.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Venu, and thank you, Annapurna. And thank you, audiences, for joining us today.